Okay. This is a general rundown of what I'm preparing to do in my YouTube and Facebook career, vlogging career. I have some major developments and some major projects that I've got coming on the way. I'm trying to figure this out, how to do this. This is sort of kind of new to me, so to speak. I am got several projects lined up for what I am going to do, and all of that. I have subjects like technology, fashion, fads, talking about like my favorite decades, of which I happen to like, which is the 70s, 80s, and 90s, most likely. Also talking, of course, a huge thing of what I want to talk about in some of my videos, in some of my vlogs, is the fashion and clothing styles of the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s. But also talking about like the advancement, or not the advancement, the kind of nostalgic, or the revisiting of certain elements of technology, like you would find in the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s, as well as just, traditional fashion, or fads, clothing of styles and stuff like that, from clothes as well. I also want to talk about like what's going on with some of the situations with our nation's shopping malls and shopping centers, and why they are in such deplorable conditions, and why some of them, or majority of them, are becoming abandoned or becoming dead malls, shopping malls, and my concerns that I have regarding that whole situation. But I also want to talk about TV, or television in general, and why I believe it was not the authority of the FTC and the FCC to end digital television broadcasting, and not to end analog television broadcasting for digital, and to create this tyranny of a digital situation where they have placed us under a forced digital mandate against our will, by basically ending analog technology, analog telecommunication systems for their prized, wonderful digital technology. That's what I'm also going to be covering. Why I am a big proponent for analog television communications and broadcasting systems. But I also am going to be talking about how certain what technology is good and what technology is not good, and what some of the things are good and versus some of the things that are not good, technology wise, and weighing the outcomes and the pros and cons to certain technology, and certain retrospect to the things that we have going according to certain things that we have now amongst our population, amongst our whole thing that we have. And my concerns, basically, attributing to what I see and some of the observations that I made, and others' observations that other peoples have made according to what they have seen, and the pros and cons to certain things that we have amongst the technological aspects of some of the technologies that we have, and outweighing the pros and the cons, as well as the overwhelming retrospective overview or kind of ideological or technological aspects to certain things that we have currently and the things that we use today. And not only that, it's just not only that, but people are abandoning cable for over-the-air antennas. Believe it or not, TV antennas are coming back more than ever. I've read some articles on some very few, no, over a few dozen websites and web articles that have stated that antenna television or using antennas for television are definitely coming back, and that they are definitely cutting the cord to their cable boxes and watching they're using antennas for their TVs, which could open the door for the returning of analog television broadcasting as well. People may not want to use a digital band of television broadcasting because it's still not superior to that of analog. Digital television broadcasting is still very, 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 very brand new in its infancy. We have not been in this digital age for very long at all. It has not been long at all within the so-called digital age that we are in currently. It's still a brand new era that we live in, and it's not as old as the analog era of telecommunications broadcasting, which is still far older than digital itself. It lasted a lot longer than the current digital age. And why I believe that analog in every ounce and every way is still very much superior to digital is because there are so many key factors involved regarding how analog and digital react and how they interact in a certain way, and why I believe analog is still somewhat superior in other instances, in other forms, and why I believe that. Not only am I going to be talking about that, and why I have some concerns with the SEC and the FTC regarding television broadcasting and telecommunications broadcasting systems, and all of that, and why I believe television broadcasting is being controlled by big government, and why big government should stay out of television in general. Television itself should be free and an open source to the general public to be able to express themselves through that without being controlled by bigger government agencies like the FCC and the FTC. And especially as an Americans that we are, we deserve to have that freedom to express our ability and what type of platform we should use to send out our message, to basically express ourselves in a certain way, that the government should not feel like that they should have to dictate to what we do. And that's all upon part of big government itself, and I don't agree to big government, and that's something I definitely don't like. Why I believe June 12th, 2009 was a huge overreach and a huge step against the will of many, many, many millions and millions and millions of Americans across the country. Their toes were stepped on by the United States government, and why I believe that this case should go all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and that of Congress and the United States Senate. And there should be some type of movements or groups according to this. Why I believe that analog should be respected, and why the big government's overreach for its digital technology as a huge, huge conflict of interest and a huge corrupt form of government, big government, which should definitely be knocked down a notch, should be shrunk a little bit, because that, to me, that's big government. Big government. Now that, to kind of, if you were to look at fashion and clothes of today, some things that I've seen today in today's fashion is not my forte. It is not my style of fashion, and I have a lot of concerns regarding style trends and what people like myself who have the same exact feelings and beliefs that I do, that the style of clothes that we have today is not as typically good as what we did have in the 1970s, the 1980s, and even the early half of the 1990s. And why people like myself like those type of styles, such as the socks, shirts, pants, coats, jackets, shoes, and shorts, and why styles back in the 1970s and 1980s and even the early half of the 1990s was the best decade for clothing and fashion in general, and why I guess is what I'm trying to get at, is that those decades, those time periods did actually have better styles that could be able to have like more color, more style, and more vibrant patterns. Today, it's very blah and bland. There's not a lot of color. There's not a lot of style. There's not a lot of somewhat within the clothes that we have today. It's very seldom. We barely have anything that could actually have actual self-expression or self kind of something that will actually add a certain in depth of style. We don't have that in today's fashion and today's clothing. It's very becoming homogenized in the form of clothing, and very blah and bland, and very plain. There's not a lot of color. There's not a lot of style. There's not a lot of depth to what we have that we used to have back in the 80s and 70s and later in the early half of the 1990s. Which definitely had depth, which definitely had pattern, definitely did have a lot of colors to certain things, such as shorts, socks, shoes, pants, coats, jackets, hats, the type of styles that we did have were very was definitely a lot wonderful, and had greater depth in style, and greater expression of wanting to be stylish, or to have that sense of style. And we don't have that today in this current decade, in this current era that we live in. So yeah, I have a lot of concerns, such as that. I'm not the only one that thinks this way regarding clothing and fashion in general. So yeah, so I'm going to be discussing a lot of this stuff in many of my vlogs, both on Facebook and on YouTube, and on like several different Facebook pages and YouTube channels that I'm going to be doing and creating. This is my third. This is actually my third official high-quality HD video vlog that I'm doing for both Facebook and YouTube. Discussing things that I have some concerns about, and not only that, just a lot of concern, and a lot of what I want to discuss, and some of my deep, passionate feelings that I have for certain things that I feel it's very, very important to talk about and to discuss about. Not only that, regarding retail, there's something I'm a big believer, and I do support online retail. No doubt about it. It's part of capitalism. Amazon. It's basically another capitalist agency, capitalizing on capitalism. I'm a pro-capitalist, and I support Amazon in its online retail industry. Other than that, I believe that traditional brick and mortar retail should also stay in existence, and that this idea to dominate the retail world and the retail community and try to destroy shopping malls and traditional box stores is ridiculous. I love shopping online. I love doing like online retail, but every type of retail community should be supported and should be propped up, and not be domineered over and destroyed because of some other type of retail way to do things. So this other retail should be done away with or destroyed, when in fact you could be doing away with people's way of life or their jobs, and putting people out of business, which is a totally bad situation for other people. And I have seen countless videos all over YouTube, and even some videos that I've seen on Facebook regarding some dead malls that are dotted across the United States, and even in Canada, and how these malls have been impacted because of online retail. And that's so bad. That's really, really bad. And I see that as a huge plight in the retail industry and the retail community. And I don't see that as a good thing. I see that as a bad thing, and why shopping malls should stay in existence and should stay as a part of the retail community along with online retail. and that online retail and that brick and mortar retail stores like shopping malls and big box stores should support each other, not try to defeat each other or destroy each other, and that they should work in tandem in order to create a perfect balance between online retail and traditional brick and mortar retail, such as your big box stores and your shopping mall centers. And that one should not dominate over the other and try to take one other out. They should both work in tandem and unison for each other's benefit, not against each other to their disadvantage. And that's that. I come from that type of belief that online retail should not destroy traditional retail, but at the same time, traditional retail should also benefit online retail. It should go both ways between two different retail industries, and why I believe the way I do regarding this, and why I feel such passion for this, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in all of my other type of vlogs that I'm going to be doing both on Facebook and YouTube, even on some of my YouTube channels and Facebook pages, public Facebook pages, that I will be creating and setting up as official public Facebook pages regarding some of this. Another thing is, in some of my concerns, well, going back to the topic of television broadcasting, if other people want to stay in using digital televisions, that's their choice. At least have the rest of the Americans who depend on a completely different form of television broadcasting, those who cannot use digital by any means, and can only use traditional televisions, such as your senior citizens and those who are much older, who cannot use digital TV sets, or even have the ability to use such technology today. They should be allowed to still receive analog television broadcasting over the air using analog television telecommunications broadcasting signals, over the air signals. And why I believe that we should turn back on the old television broadcasting systems that we used to have. In fact, we still do. Not many people know that in my research in this topic, that even on YouTube, other videos on YouTube, and even what I searched online, that there are still some analog television broadcasting signals that are still being broadcast. So not the whole analog television broadcasting apparatus or system has not been fully dismantled. That's the crux of this, and why I believe it's a huge scam from the telecommunications industry, stating the fact that they ended analog. No, they did not entirely did, because in my research has indicated that there is a huge apparatus across the United States of America that have showed that there are patches across the United States where you still have working analog television broadcasting networks and stations that are still in use to this very day, but not many Americans know about it because they were duped by basically being forced to use a completely different system than what they did use for decades. But it wasn't until June 12, 2009, when the FCC, the Federal Communications System, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, forced the many of Americans to use digital TVs and digital television over-the-air signals, which is not by any means superior to that of analog. Because if you were to look at the cliff effect, meaning it goes into a form of pixelization, and that in a certain range or in a certain topography of a geographic location, and it basically ends up going to black, and the screen goes completely blank, and which is an indicator that digital television signals and broadcasting is not in any way superior to that of the old traditional analog broadcasting. At least you might get a little fuzz on the screen, but it's still watchable and you can still see what's going on. And it doesn't pixelate and it doesn't completely go to black and become a blank screen. And a certain geography or a certain area of land, or for how many miles away you are from the broadcasting tower, the television broadcasting tower, and come to find out that not many people today have the internet as well. Not many people today have access to online video streaming. They still use VHSs, they still watch DVDs, but they also want to get their television, and the only way that they can get their television is through analog television broadcasting, not digital. Digital still does not work. If you were to look at the platform itself, you have very weak signals that are compacted into a very, very multi-stream compacted signal, where you have in a traditional analog, you have like the channels that are within that frequency are much bigger and are a lot bigger than the compacted mini streams of channels that are within digital, which has still some type of technical flaw, because they begin to break up, they begin to pixelate, they begin to not function properly, and they begin to deteriorate in their ability to stream according to the broadcasting that's sent out from the broadcast towers over the air. And it still holds a lot of major flaws in that key aspect of it. So yeah, that's my my whole take on that. There's a lot of websites that talk about it. There's a lot of people who have done the whole entire technical rundown and went throughout the whole list, the pros and the cons, but also the whole list of the very we are still, digital technology is still within its infancy, meaning it's still a young piece of technology that still has like a plethora of a series of errors within the system. And it's going to take another 2 to 3 decades to work that out. And until then, until we can get this technology, the digital technology, to run in a more smoother, better way of streaming and broadcasting, is to allow traditional analog to come back fully to be used until we can get the digital technology ready to actually be used. Now, right now, we don't actually have that means to fully use digital technology, is because we don't fully grasp how it works. We think we do, but there's so many technical foul-ups. There's still so many technical problems and issues regarding things that are digitized. There's going to be a lot of errors and a lot of technical problems and issues, but you don't get that with analog. Analog is just completely plain. It's completely pure within its form of frequency. But digital is so complex that it's like several different, it's like multiple channels within the frequency. But within, if you were to look at the frequency of analog, there's a fewer channels, but the channels that are in that frequency are a lot bigger and a lot smoother within their ability to run across the platform of broadcasting and broadcasting that signal out across over the air and across the platforms. You don't have that with digital. Digital is still a baby. It's still a baby technology, an infant. It's still within its infancy, and digital technology is not that old. It's only maybe, if you were to look at some of the very, very, very early digital technology that was developed back in the latter half of the 90s to the early 2000s. That's when digital technology started coming out in different platforms and different ways of existing in multimedia platforming and all that. But it's sort of a byproduct of Microsoft, Apple, and IBM. All those corporations and companies that, would eventually create the internet, and would people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates creating their online networks and building their own web browsers and search engines. All of that started creating the digital age later on in the latter half of the 1990s going into the 2000s. But if you were to look at the early half of the 90s to back to the 1980s, everything was digital, but it was not the type of digital that we have. The digital technology was in a more 8-bit form. 8-bit form technology where everything was an 8-bit style of digital technology and all of that. So, but it was different. It was a different type of digital technology than the digital technology that we have currently now. We still had, but the digital technology of the 80s and the early half of the 90s was still analog based, but it was in a 8-bit form of digital technology on an analog carrier wave platform that it was basically on that particular type of platform of how it was carried across the whole multimedia spectrum, so to speak. So yeah, people today are getting rid of their cable boxes, and there is a rise in using TV antennas. So they're ditching their cable boxes for TV antennas. And internet is getting so expensive that people are resorting to using antennas again. In some households, internet is getting so expensive that they have to cancel their subscription to the internet. And in order to still receive things, and to know what's going on, they have to have an antenna, because even their cable boxes their cable subscriptions have gotten so expensive that they had to cut the cord, and then they had to resort over to using antennas again. That like what people used to use uh, about three decades ago. They had 2 or 3 decades ago. They had to use antennas until we had corporations like Comcast and other cable companies coming in. In other parts of the country, you have Cox Communication, Cox Cable, which is in some other states across the United States, as well as Comcast. You also have like Spectrum, which is another cable company in other parts in some of the other states across the United States. So the majority of cable companies that we have in the United States is Comcast, which is found in all over the United States. But you also have Cox Communication and Spectrum Communications, which is other cable companies in other parts of the United States that would bring in these cable box systems. It sort of became a domination of TV in general when all these big mega corporations forced Americans back in the late 80s, early 90s onto these cable boxes and forced Americans to use these cable boxes for their TV programming and television programming. Back in the 1980s itself, back before the latter half or the later part of the latter half of the 80s, like the late 80s, back further than that, earlier than that, everybody did use antennas for their television sets. We didn't actually have cable inside the walls of our houses or of our apartments. Cables were not strung in the walls of our places where people live. The only thing that was available was an antenna. Everybody back in the 70s and 80s used antennas for their TVs. Cable, in general, didn't exist inside the walls of people's homes or apartments. It wasn't part of the whole thing until the cable boxes came into existence. If there was some sort of cable connection in people's homes, it would have probably been connected to a centralized hub going to a TV antenna on top of the house. Possibly setting that particular system up. So yeah, just like how the FCC and the FTC forced many Americans back in 2009 to use digital, they did the same thing exactly in the late 80s, early 90s by forcing many millions of Americans to use a cable box. There's another name for the cable box. I think they're called Scramblers. That's what they're called. They're called Scramblers. Back, they were channel scramblers or channel ciphers. There's many different names for these cable boxes back then, but it basically is what would be for the cable boxes that people use today, even for like the cable companies such as Frontier or Comcast have. Every time that you want to have like cable television, in order for you to get cable television, you have to have a cable box, which is another form of control. And it basically is trying to control television in general. The only way that you could view the TV is through a cable box. But I did some research, and I saw a video on YouTube. This guy connected his TV directly to the cable socket on the wall without no cable box, and he did receive some channels on his TV, but they were not digital. They were actually analog, which proves that there's even analog television signals that are going through the cable grid that connects to the cable system itself, which goes to the cable boxes that people use. But somebody ended up connecting their TV directly to the cable socket without the cable box itself, and they received some analog televisions, which is an indicator that there's still some analog television signals that are still existing today. And not many of those signals have been turned off. They are still on and very much active to this very day. And not a lot of Americans know about this. Not all of them know about it, and they should know about it. They should know that these analog systems are still running and still operating under people's noses while being stiffed by the cable companies, the telecommunications companies, and by big government and by your big corrupt politicians in power, basically. So there you have it. So that's just what I just had to say in the gist of the rundown of the things that I'm going to be talking about and stuff like that. I'll also be covering entertainment and stuff like that as well. Entertainment news and the likes, and talking about like retro gaming. I'm a huge proponent of retro gaming. I love like the old style gaming systems that people have back in the 80s, and even as far as like the mid 1990s, the middle 1990s, even from like the late 70s, 1980s, all the way up to the mid 1990s. Yeah, pretty much. So, oops, bye-bye for now. Plan to come up with some more videos again soon. Catch you all later. Bye-bye.